A Happy New Year to everybody. And a very warm welcome to everyone, especially those of you who have troubled to travel from other branches.
Turn the music off.
So some music on?
On now.
Okay, can I continue?
Carry on. Start with your race.
Especially welcome those of you who have troubled to travel from other branches outside our beautiful city of Durham area. I know you get the benefit of coming in from your villages. And also to the university students who have perhaps braved the political incorrectness barrier. Which may be more of a deterrent even than the cold and the distance. But please, next time, bring loads and loads more of you, not just a few. A thank you again to Dave and the committee of the club that we are meeting in. Anyone who's not yet a member, even if you don't live in the city of Durham, it's well worth joining. It's just £5 a year, and the discount at the bar soon recuperates even that modest outlay. Now, last year we had some distinguished speakers, one of whom, with the good luck that we sent him off with, even went on to become elected to the party's board last August. And unlike yours truly. So, by the way, I was saying that Gawain has signalled his keenness to come back at some point. Now, this evening, I have to say that we are truly privileged to welcome as our speaker Dr. Alan Mendoza, who has most generously given up the best part of 2 days to be able to be with us just for a few hours this evening. Now, Alan's name may not, as yet, resonate with you as readily as those of some of the other stars in the Reform firmament. But that is because he has only a few months ago seen the light and been brought on board by Nigel appointing him as Reform's advisor on global affairs and foreign policy. Now, I believe Alan is a robust supporter of Ukraine's independence, which should give the lie to the calumny that Nigel is an apologist for the indicted war criminal currently residing in Moscow. Alan has considerable academic distinction, possessing not only a BA from Cambridge, but also an MPhil and a PhD from that august university. And he is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. But not an academic alone. Alan also wields influence in the national and international landscape in areas connected to foreign policy and international relations. Dr. Alan Mendoza is the Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society, an international affairs think tank headquartered in London, with branches in New York and Washington. Alan was indeed a co-founder of the Henry Jackson Society 20 years ago and oversaw its transformation from a website at Cambridge University to a fully fledged organisation encompassing a high-powered research function, prominent media presence, large-scale and cross-party political support, and a famously active events programme.
The big problem with what happened after Brexit was not Brexit itself. The concept of Brexit is a good concept, and we mustn't lose sight of that. A lot of people say to you, oh, it was a failure. Well, it's been a failure because the people who carried it out did not have a vision for what it should look like. I mean, had Nigel been in charge, let's look at it this way, had he been in charge in 2016 to 2020, do you think Brexit would have turned out the way it turned out?
No.
Of course not. So that tells you the answer, doesn't it? The people in charge didn't have a view of how they would do it, and they were run rings around by the Europeans who were able to bully them into doing what they wanted. And now Keir Starmer wants to take us more into Europe again. That is without consulting anyone. It wasn't in the Labour manifesto last year. He never said to anyone, we will do this. He's trying to get us back into Europe by the back door. That's quite clear. Now, what's Reform's position? Of course Europe exists. Nobody wants to be on bad terms with our European neighbours. There's trade that we can do with them in that way, but we're not going to be sucked into dilutions of sovereignty. We should be able to trade freely with Europe in a way that we can trade with other people around the world without having to fear punishment, beatings, or Farage clauses, or all these things they want to impose in that way. How do we get to that? That's the challenge, because of course, if we come into government and say, right, we're going to renegotiate the treaties, guess what they'll do? It'll be punishment, beatings all over again. We all know that. So the way to resolve that is to now already start reaching out to our friends in Europe, and there are friends, there are people in different countries, people in governments in different European, who could be allies in this regard, and to encourage them to think about this as a win-win for Europe and Britain. We can go to war with each other, or we can actually all benefit each other. Ultimately, we want to benefit each other with trade, right? That's what we want to do, but not at the cost of single markets and sovereignty and all that. They don't need us to tell them what to do, and we don't need them to tell us what to do. And it's our job now to find those alliances in Europe to make a realistic renegotiation take place. So when we do renegotiate it, it will not be done on a sense of what can we both get out of it, rather than what can we both do to punish each other. And that relies upon, though, reaching out to people and getting those alliances in place now. And things, of course, may change in Europe. Look at I was in France last week. I think there's a very realistic chance that Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella will be the next president of France. Now, imagine if that was the case. That would totally transform France's view of the European Union and potentially doing deals with Britain. So in part, we are waiting to see what's happening on the continent as well, but we have to be ready to take advantage of those situations for our benefit. And come further forward and come further forward. Yes, you sir, no, blue, yeah.
What are your thoughts about the growth of Islam across Europe in general, and the UK in particular, bearing in mind what J.D. Vance said several weeks ago regarding the potential threat of an Islamic State potentially be the UK at some future point in time?
So this is, of course, a very charged topic, okay, and we have to, be cognizant of that. We start with the look. I've looked at radical Islam for 20 years. I've done it for 20 years. I've understood it. My former colleague Douglas Murray, some of you would have read his work and seen what he said. A lot of work on the subject. And of course, the difficulty with this is Islam is a very complicated religion. It is a religion with many different interpretations and many different viewpoints. I can introduce you to people who are very liberal Muslims, who are very spiritual Muslims, and I can also, not introduce you because I wouldn't know them, but I can also show you people who are very aggressive, conservative, militant, radical Muslims. Okay, and all of them can trace some reality in their religion to what they believe is the truth in this way. So where does that leave us then, if we've got this very complicated situation? It's obvious. We have to drive these radicals completely out of our country. There's nothing remotely in the British tradition about radical Islam. Nothing at all. It will never be anything, because they want to supplant our system with their version of the world, basically. And you started to see that. Look at this chaos in Birmingham, the West Midlands police. Look at this insanity that happened there. It's taken a while to unravel it, okay? But we've now found out the following: that this ban on these Israeli football fans started off because there was a fear from the West Midlands police that local radical Muslims would arm themselves and attack these people if they came to the football match. The police, it appears, then thought, rather than arresting the people who were threatening violence and doing these things, thought, let's try and find reasons why we have to get a ban, which won't be that the Muslims are trying to kill people, but actually that they're hooligans, and they started making up lies about it. The Dutch police told us this, the Jewish community told us that. All this nonsense that has all unravelled over time. And was it yesterday we learned that there was an AI report, they'd relied on AI for some of their information. I mean, this is such a mess. The terrible danger of this is that what's happened is the police have been captured by a group of people, and they have decided to go along with a fundamentally un-British thing, which is banning people from attending football matches, simply because their politics aren't what these people's politics are. That is a sign that we're in very troubled territory as a country, because the radicals are gaining strength. There's no doubt about it. The radicals, by the way, menace moderate Muslims, I can assure you of that. The moderate Muslims I speak to are terrified of the radicals, because the radicals come for them first. You can imagine, for example, if you are a moderate Muslim, You've had a drink, say, at the bar, and someone's dobbed you in, right? And suddenly these guys come to your door and they say, brother, we hear that you've been drinking. What is this? Or this? It's very threatening and menacing. They're trying to enforce hardcore religion on even their fellow co-religionists in this sort of way. So the only way you can deal with this is by having a war on radical Islam. There's no choice about it. You've got to do that. And let me be frank, this government is nowhere near that. This government can barely even mention the words radical Islam. The right thing always starts with what is right for the British people. That is the start of any sensible foreign policy. And we've got to remember that point as we look forward in those alliances and as well. We shouldn't be afraid of leaving things that we think are no longer effective. There are many UN agencies, for example, where we shouldn't be a part of. The UN Human Rights Council, for example, it's an absolute joke. These people elected Iran onto their body last year. Why are we a part of this nonsense? This is a waste of our money. We shouldn't be funding it. Agencies like UNRWA. UNRWA is the agency that funded Gaza and the Palestinians. It was riddled with sympathy for Hamas. We've been putting millions into it every year. Why? This is insanity from our perspective. This is not something Britain should be doing going forward. It's not in the interest of the British people or indeed in our strategic interests worldwide. We've done it because we've just done it. We're so used to not thinking for ourselves internationally that we have been, mistaken down that path. So we've got to take those ideas and we've got to look carefully. What is it? What are our interests again? We should be guided by interests. We should, of course, look for allies. Britain, realistically in the modern world, needs allies to do things as well. But those allies need to be the people who agree with us, not the people who disagree. We need to find the people who are going to be tomorrow's people, tomorrow's allies in the world, rather than thinking necessarily that it's the people who were allies 50 years ago. Of course, there's always going to be a commonality. Values are important. Fellow democracies are important. There's no doubt about it, because they're much more likely to think like us. But if they're not prepared to walk the walk in terms of what's really important from 2026 and going onwards, then they're not useful allies anymore. And I think a lot of it will be about utility going forwards. What can we give our allies, and crucially, what can they give us? We've not been doing enough about that, and we've not been also using the levers of power at our disposal. We've got an amazing diplomatic reach. We've got still an effective military, even though it's been somewhat torn apart. We need more of it, but we need to be showing people that we're a factor in the world, that we're not going to be quiet. We're going to be loud and proud. We're going to bang the British drum, and we're going to make a difference that way. And to give you one idea of what that could look like, it's a challenge for anyone in this room. Let's see who can get it, if anyone can get it. We sit on the UN permanent member of the Security Council. We have a veto. When was the last time that Britain used its veto in the UN? Any ideas? Any ideas at all?
1960.
No, a bit later than that. No, a bit later. Well, no, that wasn't a bit later than that.
1980.
In the 80s, I'll give you a clue. Margaret Thatcher was the last person to do it. Think about that. She was the last Prime Minister to authorise the use of the veto. Well, that's crazy. Think about it. That is now 45, 46 years ago. Now, we are an important power in the world. We've been scared of doing it because everyone goes, Britain can't do that sort of thing anymore. Everyone will think it's illegitimate. Screw that. The world exists on power as it is, not how you might want it to be. You might not want Britain to have the veto, but we've got it. We should use it. And if we need to, Chagos Islands would have been a great example of this. This betrayal, this absolute betrayal. Look at Starmer versus Trump. You can't compare the two. But look at this for a second. Starmer is so keen to give away territory that he wants to pay other people to take it. Pays them, and we'll all be paying that price for decades to come. Trump is so willing to take territory, he will arrest foreign leaders and kind of go in there and make people do what he wants in this sort of way. Now, I'm not suggesting we should arrest the president of Mauritius in quite that same way, but all we had to do was say no and back it up with the UN veto, and that would have been the end of it in that sort of way. But we're terrified of it because we've got used to thinking in small-minded ways about this country. This is a great country. This is a country that had the largest empire in the history of the world. This is a country that brought progress to many places. Okay, yeah, there were some bad parts of the empire too, of course there were. But we should, enough apologising for that. We have a history, we gave, liberty to the world, freedom, ideas of law, justice, those things. And it's no secret, is it, that we're losing those things at home, and as a result, we're losing the thinking about that abroad as well.
So, if the Minsk agreement had been signed by Boris Johnson, would that have stopped the invasion of Russia into Ukraine?
Well, that's interesting. So, what we're referring to are the Minsk agreements, which were taking place, discussions between Russia, Ukraine, and others after the Crimea invasion and after some of the incursions into Eastern Europe. And the problem with Minsk was, it wasn't a question of whether we were going to sign them or not. The reality was, what Putin was trying to do there was legitimise his gains, basically. And if you start legitimising aggression of any kind, you end up having more aggression. Minsk would not have stopped further, would have signed it, and then Putin would have returned 5 years later and gone, I'll have some more, thank you very much. Because it would have given him too much, I think. Again, I stress what I said before. Dictators only understand one thing. It is the boot on their neck. It is the pressure they face and the choice they have to make between winning and losing. And sometimes they don't get it right. Maduro was a great example. Maduro was offered a deal by Trump the week before he was removed. He said, look, I'm coming for you, Trump said, but I'll give you a chance to leave. I'll give you loads of money, you can live in Turkey, enjoy your life, basically. Mm-hmm. Maduro didn't believe him. He said, come and get me. And what happened? Putin will make the same mistake. He's been offered off-ramps, he's refused to take them, and at some point he will be forced to push into a situation where he will not be able to get out of, and it'll be much worse for him. He doesn't know when to quit. That's the problem with dictators. They keep on going and going and going. And so, unfortunately, I don't think Minsk would have solved the problem. Now, had we, right at the start, years ago, with Georgia, 2008, had we reacted differently to that, well, maybe we could have had a different sector, because that undoubtedly empowered Putin. He got away with it. He took those two enclaves, and he thought, oh, I'll have some more, thank you very much. And he came back for more in Ukraine and beyond. You've got to stop them at the start. Had we, history lesson, had we stopped Hitler when he walked into the Rhineland in 1936, had we done it then, we now know Hitler was expecting the French to resist, and he thought we would lose and we'd have to flee, and it'd be a disaster at the end of the Third Reich in that way. And what did? We just let him take it. Yeah. And by the time we then did stand up to him in Poland, 3 years later, it was too late, because he'd amassed this incredible force by that point in time. You've got to stop dictators early. If you don't, you will rue the consequences. I'm going to take them all there. I'll come back to you. Yes.
It was a great talk, but one of the things you noticed was saying how strong Britain can be. So over the past 30 years, the US has maintained about a quarter of world GDP. Yes. In the 90s, the UK used to have double the GDP of India and China combined. Now we're a much smaller fraction of the world. Is all this talk still relevant, given how Britain actually is nowadays compared to the rest of the world economically?
Well, so you're talking about relative decline, and there's no doubt that Britain has relatively declined, but that's not necessarily because we have done particularly badly, it's because others are doing really well. India, China, for example, have got huge advantages over us. Population. Look at they're over 1 billion people each. Per capita GDP, we're still way ahead of them. And that's going to be the case for some time. So it's not necessarily looking at the notion of decline, it's what you can do with your resources still. The key to it, though, is growth. We have to grow as an economy. There is no doubt about that. Everything we want to do as a country relies upon growth. If we're going to get 0.1% growth, or minus 0.1%, as we just heard today or yesterday, whenever it was, the latest figures, we're not going to get any growth. We're not going to be able to do anything. But if we can achieve, even something approaching 2.5% or 3% of GDP, which is a tough ask, given where we've been in the last 15, 20 years, we're in a different place. We will, we will not be India and China. I agree with you on that. But we will still be a first-rank power with a first-rank economy and can do a lot more. But it relies upon that growth. So I think the answer is always predicated on that. Continue as we are under this government, the previous government, we're going to go nowhere. And, the doomsters are going to get their way. But if we can restore, and that's what the economic team are trying to think of, the plans are going to restore the country, we will have the ability to have jam, today domestically and internationally, and we can do that. So the growth agenda is key to everything. We don't get that, forget it. And we can help that by growth agenda international policy with the trading wins that we can get and increasing investment into the UK. You may have seen some stories in the last week about the UAE, right? And about reform, UAE and reform in that sort of way. And it is true that they have been very interested, it seems, in what reform are proposing economically. Why? Well, they want to invest in the UK. They want to put billions of pounds into the UK that we can then leverage into our industries, into our economy, and help deliver that growth agenda. So the point about foreign policy is it can actually lead to big wins in this way. We've got to get the domestic scene right as well to boost our domestic economy. But a lot of it is also about what can we bring in. If we do that, I think we have the potential to again play a much bigger role than we've been doing to date. The defence industry is actually key. We start remilitarising and rebuilding, okay, we have the potential to firstly get jobs going, investment, and also sell things to other people, which is quite interesting as well. So a good example is this new missile we're developing with Ukraine. So we're coming up with an idea of a new missile, a long-range missile, which the UK will help Ukraine develop. So they will use it, but guess what? We will have it, and we can sell it to other people, and we can build it here, and we will be able to build jobs that way, and also increase export and increase the economic benefit from it. You do that in more areas, you start having a viable defence industry. Our defence industry is pretty good, although there have been some problems like the Ajax, debacle and things like that. But people want to still buy British kit. They want to buy it. They want better British kit. We've got to give them better British kit, which is going to help secure the homeland as well and do those things. And actually, the Navy point is an interesting one. I said about Britain's first principles in foreign policy. The Navy's always been the first principle. The Navy, the idea that we as an island can, somehow survive without naval support has never been part of our history. Yes, things have changed in terms of drones, airplanes, all those sorts of things. But ultimately, Britain's security has always revolved about preventing people from ever being able to invade this country. And you need ships to do that. That, by the way, could help with illegal immigrants as well. But it is about stopping, that force. And if you think, oh, that's very abstract, well, it isn't. We know the Russians are constantly engaged in mapping our undersea cables. Okay, and these undersea cables, everyone always talks about them. Let me talk about this for a second. All the data in this country, all our communications go through, not the satellites, through cables. Fibre optic cables carry things through, other things going under the sea that connect us with other continents and beyond. As an island, we are quite susceptible to being attacked, because if you cut those cables, we lose. We have no data. And we lose control of a lot of things. No banking, no ability to kind of exchange goods, buy things. It's quite a serious issue. Well, how do you stop that? You've got to have a mitigating a naval force that can stop the Russians from engaging in your area and trying to map your cables, and then ultimately maybe trying to sabotage them. So you've got to have a naval force to do that. So yes, of course we want to power project beyond, but I only think the two things go hand in hand. Your first defence is always domestically and thinking about this island and what we need to do in our immediate proximity. And everything we need to do further afield, I can assure you, it all also needs to be done closer to home. And so I'm confident that if we go through this process, and it does require remilitarisation, reindustrialisation, so that we do produce these things at home rather than be susceptible to foreign attacks in this way, or to have control of them by other things. I mean, a few years ago, you'll remember this whole debacle about the 5G and Huawei, the Chinese company that was trying to build all our 5G masts. Well, we actually led the campaign on Henry Jackson idea to stop that from happening. Why? The government told us at the time, Boris Johnson's government said, it's fine, there are safeguards, there's no problem at all with this, we can prevent it. Well, we know that's nonsense. We know any Chinese company has a legal obligation to give the Chinese government any data the Chinese government wants. And all this talk about firewalls and things, it's nonsense. The Chinese are able to, and have shown that they can steal things from us. They have shown their ability to burrow into our systems and infrastructure and get what they want from the UK. So the idea that we'd have been able to keep them out of our 5G key secrets was nonsense. So we stopped it from happening. And we've got to do the same thing on all critical infrastructure. The easy answer to your question is, of course, America is our indispensable ally. It remains our indispensable ally. The basis of global security since the Second World War has been the UK-US relationship and more broadly the European-American relationship. And yes, that has undergone some strain over the last few years. But it is strain that has actually occasioned, not simply by President Trump, but by American presidents realising the Europeans have for a long time been freeloading and have not been contributing their share of defence to that alliance, to the thing that we need to be doing in that sort of way. So could it go back to what it was? No. But the Americans have woken up to the fact that it is not necessarily in their interest to pay for everyone's security. Why should it be? We're a very rich part of the world. We should be doing more in that regard, to spend more money in our own defence. It gives us a voice and a sense of purpose once again to do so as well. There are valuable reasons to do it. And I think the thing with the Americans is not that they're not becoming isolationists, they're not becoming inward-looking. What they are looking at is they are assessing the relationships and going, well, what's the point of this relationship? What's the point of a relationship when we are paying for 90% of it and we're getting nothing back from these people in this regard? They should be doing a lot more. I think there's a rebalancing opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to rebalance that relationship with the Americans, to recognise that they obviously have national interest, and we have national interest too, but that ultimately I think we will find that when we do rebalance the relationship, the Americans will be firstly grateful for the idea that we are now playing our part in this, that we will also have rediscovered our own sense, which they want us to do in that respect as well, and we'll be able to do a lot more together because there will be a lesser relative imbalance of power between the parties. Right now, the Americans are the only game in town when it comes to global security. There's no other. Europe can't do it. You don't want China doing it, for sure. You don't want Russia doing it, and they lack the capacity anyway, as we've seen. The point is, we've got to deal with the Americans. We've got to show them that we are partners for them, that they want to deal with in that regard. And I think we will find the Americans will inevitably recognise that whatever the short-term gains of doing X, Y, and Z, ultimately their best allies in the world are also the people who think like them in the broadest sense of being democracies, of being supportive of similar values in that respect. But it does require us to do our part there. And on your point about what is Trump doing with Russia and China, look, Trump and Putin I do think is a weird relationship, there's no doubt about it. Totally very, very unusual. But the thing about Washington and the power structures is that there are multiple ways to get to a certain point. I think Trump sets a certain direction, and then you will zigzag wildly to get there. And I think you've seen that over time in terms of what he's doing in that respect. I think in general, when it comes to Russia, there is a game the Americans are playing, which is, we want to orient Russia against China. Now, I don't personally necessarily agree with this as being a sensible strategy, but there is a view that says we've got to break the Russia-China axis because the Chinese are, the coming power, the coming threat, basically. The Russians are not. Everyone knows the Russians are not the coming power. They are yesterday's power, and they're diminishing even before our eyes. I mean, look at the mess they've gotten into in Ukraine. And look at the mess, by the way, that they got into Ukraine and meant that they couldn't interfere in the Middle East. Syria fell. The Israel war happened, they couldn't do anything. Iran is on the rocks, and Venezuela, they did nothing. Why? They don't have the capacity to do anything. So the question is, can they be dissociated? I don't think they can, but there is a view in Washington that they might be able to do that. They're trying, a lot of policy that way. The aim is, though, to still defend China and look at that. The Venezuela thing, Rubio let the cat out of the bag. He said, we don't need Venezuela's oil. And they don't need Venezuela's oil. There's no, yes, it's helpful to American companies, fine, but they don't need it for their own national reserves, but it denies China that oil, basically. And if Iran falls, it denies China that oil. And suddenly China becomes weaker as a result without a shot being fired in that respect. So I think we have to, the Americans think of strategy in a very different way to we do. We used to think like this. When we had a global footprint, we thought of this as well. We thought, what happens if we do this and it could happen that? And we don't think of it that way. We are guilty of playing in 2 dimensions, and the Americans are still playing in 3 dimensions. And I think we have to see how this rolls out. There is a chance you're right, and there are some bad things that will come about it. But I think at the moment, actually, there's a lot of wisdom in what's going on, and it's going to get us to a much better place than before. So I say look at it in 3D rather than 2D. Every single domestic capacity we have in order to improve the situation, because we will never get rich by having these crazy energy prices. And it does come down to supply and security, you're right. It comes down to the fact that if we control again our own energy destiny, we can't be influenced by overseas. It won't happen in that regard. You're looking like you might want to come back on it, though.
Well, yes, because, as we know, we import so much energy from France, from Norway.
Yes.
We're reluctant to drill for oil in the North Sea.
I'm saying we should be drill, baby, drill. It's there.
I mean, it's an absolute nonsense what's going on. And Drax Power Station to cut down swathes of forests in North America, turn those trees, which absorb carbon, by the way, and store it, turn them into wood chips, bring them to the UK, throw them on a power station, throw diesel on to make sure it burns. How on earth can we support that?
We can't, and you just obviously highlighted the nonsense of it, and of course Reform understands that. which is why you're going to get a British energy policy that will rely on British energy and none of this nonsense, basically.
Well, I do hope so. And I do
It's going to come. But I do think actually interesting, nuclear offers the most interesting path. We've been a bit skittish. We've allowed our nuclear industry, and we used to have a fairly good nuclear industry. We've allowed it to atrophy. It's a big mistake. The French, we buy stuff from them because their nuclear energy is incredible.
And the Chinese.
Well, let's not go there. And if you give them control of the nuclear energy, then that's not energy security, is it? That is energy weakness. So we have to redevelop our own nuclear industry, because that is, again, it is going to be cheap and clean fuel that we can use. So yes, I'm very much in favour of that. Yes, I agree.
We're standing here
Yes.
in the biggest rural county, and our farmers are being absolutely abused on a daily basis and being forced to put in wind farms and solar farms. We need to produce for this country, and it's going to go. Our farming industry is going to just be wiped out.
And that's a terrible tragedy.
Absolutely.
And it's bad for food security.
Yes. How are we going to stop that?
Well, the first thing is by stopping this sort of madness about having to put your windmill up and all the rest of it in this way. By the way, the idea of solar panels, I mean, there was this whole sort of argument. I heard on the radio the other day, the number of sunny days in Newcastle, say, compared to Bournemouth, totally different, kind of environment. Why would you try and impose solar in Newcastle? It makes no sense from any kind of perspective, apart from some crazed ideology.
It's actually no sense when they're covered in snow. It's no sense at all when they're covered in snow.
Thank you, exactly, all the rest of it. So, come on, we've got to get real about this, which is that the farming industry is key to our food security purpose.
It's dying.
Of course it's dying, and we've seen, look at the disasters, thank goodness the government, did their U-turn on inheritance tax, all the rest of it. Farmers have been neglected for so long, and they are, if you like, the basis for everything we do, because we don't have that produce grown here. Importing it would lead to an absolute disaster. Again, from a security perspective, keeping it in the foreign policy, you want to have control of your food supply. You want to have an industry that can supply you in that way. It's good, of course, for areas like this, which it's a main big industry. It's helpful for jobs, of course. It's helpful for prosperity, but it's also helpful for security. And again, we have to see the wins in all these areas. And I think you've seen that obviously the leadership has been very keen to support the farmers in their travails, and will continue to do so. And it's going to require a big heft to get farming back up again and make it an industry that people want to join again rather than leave.
It's not just about the farming though, it's about the rural communities.
Yes, of course it is. It's about a way of life. It's about a way of life, isn't it?
Yeah. And our history.
Yes, and again, this has been an important part of what made Britain. And we can't lose that way of life. We're not going to all become automatons living in metropolitan areas. That's not how this works, and it shouldn't ever work like that either.
My question is, so Britain left the EU, but Europe still there. So what kind of relationship reform foresee between Britain and bigger Europe?
Well, Reform has promised to renegotiate some of these treaties already in terms of what happened after Brexit. I think that, the big problem with what happened after Brexit was not Brexit itself. The concept of Brexit is a good concept, and we mustn't lose sight of that. A lot of people say to you, it was a failure. Well, it's been a failure because the people who carried it out did not have a vision for what it should look like. I mean, had Nigel been in charge, let's look at it this way, had he been in charge in 2016 to 2020, do you think Brexit would have turned out the way it turned out?
No.
Of course not. So that tells you the answer, doesn't it? The people in charge didn't have a view of how they would do it, and they were run rings around by the Europeans who were able to bully them into doing what they wanted. And now Keir Starmer wants to take us more into Europe again. That is without consulting anyone. It wasn't in the Labour manifesto last year. He never said to anyone, we will do this. He's trying to get us back into Europe by the back door. That's quite clear. Now, what's Reform's position? Of course Europe exists. Nobody wants to be on bad terms with our European neighbours. There is trade that we can do with them in that way, but we're not going to be sucked into dilutions of sovereignty. We should be able to trade freely with Europe in a way that we can trade with other people around the world without having to fear punishment, beatings, or Farage clauses, or all these things they want to impose in that way. How do we get to that? That's the challenge. Because, of course, if we come into government and say, right, we're going to renegotiate the treaties, guess what they'll do? It'll be punishment, beatings all over again. We all know that. So the way to resolve that is to now already start reaching out to our friends in Europe, and there are friends, there are people in different countries, people in governments in different European, who could be allies in this regard, and to encourage them to think about this as a win-win for Europe and Britain. We can go to war with each other, or we can actually all benefit each other. Ultimately, we want to benefit each other with trade, right? That's what we want to do, but not at the cost of single markets and sovereignty and all that. They don't need us to tell them what to do, and we don't need them to tell us what to do. And it's our job now to find those alliances in Europe to make a realistic renegotiation take place. So when we do renegotiate it, it will not be done on a sense of what can we both get out of it, rather than what can we both do to punish each other. And that relies upon, though, reaching out to people and getting those alliances in place now. And things, of course, may change in Europe. Look at I was in France last week. I think there's a very realistic chance that Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella will be the next president of France. Now, imagine if that was the case. That would totally transform France's view of the European Union and potentially doing deals with Britain. So in part, we are waiting to see what's happening on the continent as well, but we have to be ready to take advantage of those situations for our benefit.
What are your thoughts about the growth of Islam across Europe in general and the UK in particular, bearing in mind what J.D. Vance said several weeks ago regarding the potential threat of an Islamic state potentially being the UK at some future point in time?
So this is, of course, a very charged topic, okay, and we have to, be cognizant of that. We start with the look. I've looked at radical Islam for 20 years. I've done it for 20 years. I've understood it. My former colleague Douglas Murray, some of you will have read his work and seen what he said. A lot of work on the subject, and of course, the difficulty with this is Islam is a very complicated religion. It is a religion with many different interpretations and many different viewpoints. I can introduce you to people who are very liberal Muslims, who are very spiritual Muslims, and I can also, not introduce you because I wouldn't know them, but I can also show you people who are very aggressive, conservative, militant, radical Muslims. Okay, and all of them can trace some reality in their religion to what they believe is the truth in this way. So where does that leave us then, if we've got this very complicated situation? It's obvious. We have to drive these radicals completely out of our country. There's nothing remotely in the British tradition about radical Islam. Nothing at all. It will never be anything, because they want to supplant our system with their version of the world, basically. And you started to see that. Look at this chaos in Birmingham, the West Midlands police. Look at this insanity that happened there. It's taken a while to unravel it, okay, but we've now found out the following. That this ban on these Israeli football fans started off because there was a fear from the West Midlands police that local radical Muslims would arm themselves and attack these people if they came to the football match. The police, it appears, then thought, rather than arresting the people who were threatening violence and doing these things, thought, let's try and find reasons why we have to get a ban, which won't be that the Muslims are trying to kill people, but actually that they're hooligans, and they started making up lies about it. The Dutch police told us this, the Jewish community told us that. All this nonsense that has all unravelled over time. And was it yesterday we learned that there was an AI report, they'd relied on AI for some of their information. I mean, this is such a mess. The terrible danger of this is that what's happened is that police have been captured by a group of people, and they have decided to go along with a fundamentally un-British thing, which is banning people from attending football matches, simply because their politics aren't what these people's politics are. That is a sign that we're in very troubled territory as a country, because the radicals are gaining strength. There's no doubt about it. The radicals, by the way, menace moderate Muslims. I can assure you of that. The moderate Muslims I speak to are terrified of the radicals, because the radicals come for them first. You can imagine, for example, if you are a moderate Muslim, you've had a drink, say, at the bar, and someone's dobbed you in, right? And suddenly these guys come to your door and they say, "Brother, we hear that you've been drinking. What is this?" All this. It's very threatening and menacing. They're trying to enforce hardcore religion on even their fellow co-religionists in this sort of way. So the only way you can deal with this is by having a war on radical Islam. There's no choice about it. You've got to do that. And let me be frank, this government is nowhere near that. This government can barely even mention the words radical Islam. When radical Muslims go around, attacking people or stabbing Jews or whatever it may be, the government can't even bring themselves to talk about it as being a subject. Oh, it's a terrorist act. But who committed it? What was going on here? So this government won't do anything. The last government was responsible for the biggest growth in radical Islam in this sort of way. again, Reform have got a clear policy on this. We're going to ban the Muslim Brotherhood straight away. The Muslim Brotherhood is one of the most insidious groups in the world. It is a group that has promoted radical Islam everywhere it goes. It poisons local Muslim communities, and it does very dangerous work within them and beyond. We've got to get to the root of this problem. And, the root, I say, is, for people who cannot and will not live in this country in a way that is commensurate with our values, they've got to live. Beefing up the border control, making the French do what we pay them to do, all the rest of it in this sort of way. I have no doubt that and I think we will be exploring other methods as well. This whole talk about international law, you can't, for example, stop the votes. Well, there are easily ways you can come around it. If the Australians can manage to do that, we can manage to do that as well. Okay, and the Australians, if you remember, had a very successful policy of bumping the votes out and preventing this from happening. If the French don't want them, tough. They've come from France, we're going to push them back, and we need to be tough with the French on this regard. By the way, it's shameful. We have spent billions of pounds, taxpayers' money, on the French stopping illegal migrants, and they don't stop them. Only recently we got, we can now stop them, once, as they're getting into boats, not in the boats, but as they're getting into the boats, we can stop them. The French have decided they can do that. It's all nonsense. They've been taking us for a ride all this time. And it's, again, shocking that we have successive governments have thought, we'll pay them to stop it, and they've done nothing. We've not hit back at them. I'd like to see, British warships necessarily, pushing them back, and then if the French want to fight, we'll give them a fight on the subject. Because, we cannot have this kind of invasion, and it is an invasion. The numbers are an invasion when you see thousands streaming across like that, which is basically being countenanced by the French. It is shocking, and we need to fight back on that score. But there's a broader picture as well. We have to, make it quite clear that part of the reason people are coming here is A, because they can just come here, and B, they get benefits for doing so. That's got to stop. All this system has to stop. The comfort system has to stop. People have to start thinking Britain is not a soft touch, it's the hardest touch. Because if you start making us the hardest touch, they'll stay in France. They'll go to Germany. Whatever it is in that sort of sense. Nobody wants to come to the hardest touch, do they? They don't want to do that. So it's quite simple how we do it and look at it. But there's a broader situation, a broader problem we haven't really addressed, which is legal migration as well. This country's population has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. Not through illegal migration, there has been some of that of course, but through legal migration. Yes, okay, the numbers are now starting to come down, finally. But the reality is that even if you have a net migration of what it was last year of 200,000, if you take the gross figures, that's a huge population churn. That was actually 900,000 people coming in and 700,000 leaving. And they go, oh no, it's 200,000. It's not. There's a massive churn in our population year on year on year. And nobody ever voted for that. Nobody said we wanted to totally transform our population into something that it wasn't 20 years ago. It never occurred in that way. We have to be very clear about what the benefits and the costs of legal migration are as well, and what we benefit from it versus what the costs are. And if the costs are that it is actually a huge drain in infrastructure, it is actually again leading to more welfare rather than sort of people coming in for economic purposes, because what's the point, by the way, of having low-skilled labour coming in, and the low-skilled labour brings in 4 or 5 dependents who are then paid for by the state? What's the point of that? It makes no sense economically. It is madness. It means that we are subsidising those people to do, low-skilled jobs, but the cost of it is massive to the country. Better to bump up the wages, make them into highly paid jobs, and get rid of the dependents in this sort of way, in this sort of setup. So we need to have a legal migration strategy as well, and look at how we can address that side of things, because it hasn't benefited the economy. I think increasingly people recognise that all this talk that a lot of migration is good for the economy is not correct, because you have to look at the economic benefits that people bring by doing those jobs and the costs as well, and we need to look at that side. And I think you're going to see a lot of policies this year. I mean, there's big policy reviews underway. By the end of this year, not only will Reform have established itself firmly as the leading party in local government in terms of winning elections and that sort of thing, which we've already seen happen, but it should also by the end have a team of talented people at the top who don't go, that's a potential government, and the policies in place that people can understand straight away where we stand on these things, and they'll be guided by common sense. I can tell you that for nothing. Right. Yes.
Yeah, space and place are social constructs, and I'd like to think that we all accept people from different backgrounds,
totally, of course,
different nationalities. Now, there are obviously large populations of Muslim communities around the country, and they set up their own infrastructures and their own law, so Sharia law. What would reform to ensure that we're all governed by the same law?
So again, it's an interesting question. It's looking at obviously what happens, I suppose, in ghettoisation really in this sort of setup. So I think we've got a problem here that obviously we have now areas of the country which are fairly ghettoised. They have become monocultural, and they're not British monoculture. They are a different kind of monoculture. That is no good for a country because it means there's no social cohesion. It means you can literally live cheek by jowl with people in the neighbouring ward even and have totally different ways of life. Now that is not a sustainable way for a country to build itself or to build national pride or unity on. So the obvious solution to this is you've got to break up the ghettos. There's no way around that. Break them up and start sort of changing population structures and making people, basically forcing integration. Now, the good part of this is we know it actually works. We did a survey of British Muslims in 2020, and which showed uniformly that you had the most liberal views, liberal in the sense of British values views, from people who were the least segregated. Okay, so for example, a Muslim in Devon is going to be totally different in mindset to somebody living in the heart of Bradford. Simply because of surroundings, neighbourhood, and how this works, basically. It's not to say the person in Bradford is any worse or better than the person in Devon, it's down to different local circumstances. Everyone knows that the optimal way to build that national identity is to have integration and sometimes you have to force integration. One of the big problems we've had is we've allowed this to occur where you have problems galore. Great example, this Aston Villa thing I quoted earlier. Aston Ward in Birmingham. What is the Muslim percentage of Aston Ward? Any guesses? 79% in the last time, in the sense of 2021. If you have 79% in one area, how are you? And then you have some very extreme people within that number who are trying to enforce their views. It becomes very difficult, firstly, for the moderates to deal with that, number one. And number two, there's no sort of point of, we're going to point to this as an alternative we should be doing in this sort of way. That is deeply concerning. And so that part of the whole integration agenda needs to be followed through. The other good news is, there have been numerous studies over the last 10 years, done by people like Baroness Louise Casey and Sarah Khan. They have looked at what you need to do to increase integration and how you break up ghettoisation. The problem is that the government, the Commission and the Tories didn't do it, and this government won't do it either. So actually we should be dusting those off and going, right, what's still relevant here? What do we need to do more of? And can we get to the basics here, which is everyone's going to speak English, we're going to understand the commonality of what it is to be in this country and what those base values are. You can be Muslim, there's no problem with that, but you will not be enforcing Sharia law on either your own people or us in this sort of way. That's not going to happen. And it's, we are all British here. If you're British, you're British. You're not anything else. You can be a British Muslim, no problem at all, but you're not going to have Sharia law because that is not part of the British tradition, history or culture. If we can say that loudly and proudly, and I think everyone will respect that, and I think we'll have a better result as a consequence as well.
Can we also say that it would help the population of people who own guide dogs as well?
Guide dogs?
Yeah, because Muslims, especially radical Muslims, they're not very happy with guide dogs.
Yes, I think that might be down to, a sort of sense that a dog is not a particularly keen animal. Yes, exactly, in that sort of sense. No, totally, and I think, look, and actually the point you're making is even more important, because let's imagine you are a blind British Muslim, okay, and you can't have a guide dog because somebody has said this is terrible. Your own quality of life has been diminished by a religious diktat that's got nothing to do with British, state guidance in this sort of sense.
Well, that's why a Muslim I know who owns a guide dog had to get his local imam to create, to actually tell the people.
Gosh.
Well, I don't. It's not exactly a fatwa, but it's a particular type of a legal Sharia court injunction that says, this guy is allowed this dog for these reasons.
Well, so you've just proved the point then, basically, which is that if you allow, kind of religious diktats to override British law, then you're into a disastrous place. And the people who lose out are the vulnerable people who need certain help in this regard. And that's really what it's about. It's about preventing people from taking 7th century, rules and transposing them on people who want to live in the 21st century. Yes, I'm going to back in, yeah.
Alan, thank you very much. I mean, you've covered an enormous area. But perhaps you could just spend a little bit of time explaining something which affects us all in this room: energy security. It affects us all. What have we got in the United Kingdom? We've got oil, we've got gas. We could have more nuclear. We've got hydro. We've got coal. Oh, by the way, coal is less polluting than burning wood chips at Drax Power Station. And yet we don't seem... And you talked about the economy.
Yes.
And having an industrial base. But we can do none of that unless we develop energy security.
Correct.
So how on earth are we going to get rid of Matt Miliband?
Well, wouldn't you find it amusing to think that Ed Miliband is now being thought of as the next Labour leader? I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it?
Well, it's good for reform.
Well, of course it's good for reform, but I mean, would the country survive, this sort of setup? So, look, we all know, Nigel says at every opportunity, does he not? It is high energy costs are killing this country. The energy costs in this country are insane if you think about it, in terms of they are crippling business, they're preventing they're hurting our every household because of the costs we have to pay for heat. I was my heating bill last month, I was like, what the heck has happened? I think everyone recognises that it's over, okay? Miliband can do what he wants in this regard, but everyone knows the reform government coming in is not going to, pay anything more than, kind of occasional notice of global warming and this sort of thing. It's going to look at this from the perspective of, we've got to get the energy prices down. What we do here matters not when China and India are polluting like nobody's business. If you really believe that's the cause, what are they doing about it? Our tiny sliver of emissions is not going to make any blind bit of difference here. So why are we crippling ourselves for that purpose? It's going to be about kind of refinding. We've still got oil reserves. We're not developing those. Gas reserves. We're not developing those. Yes, it costs a bit of money, but ultimately it'd be worth it to go in that path. The nuclear side, much more needs to be done there in that respect as well. And I'm not against using coal either to bring the price down in this regard. So we've got to look at every single domestic capacity we have in order to improve the situation. Because we will never get rich by having these crazy, energy prices. And it does come down to supply and security, you're right. It comes down to the fact that if we control again our own energy destiny, we can't be influenced by overseas. It won't happen in that regard. Did you looking like you might want to come back on it, though?
Well, yes, because, as we know, we import so much energy from France, from Norway.
Yes.
We're reluctant to drill for oil in the North Sea.
I'm saying we should be drill, baby, drill. It's there. Yes.
I mean, it's an absolute nonsense what's going on. And Drax Power Station to cut down swathes of forests in North America, turn those trees, which absorb carbon, by the way, and store it, turn them into wood chips, bring them to the UK, throw them on a power station, throw diesel on to make sure it burns. How on earth can we support that?
We can't, and you just obviously highlighted the nonsense of it, and of course Reform understands that, which is why you're going to get a British energy policy that will rely British energy and none of this nonsense, basically.
Well, I do hope so.
It's going to come. But I do think, actually, interesting, nuclear offers the most interesting path. We've been a bit skittish. We've allowed our nuclear industry, we used to have a fairly good nuclear industry, we've allowed it to atrophy. It's a big mistake. The French, we buy stuff from them because their nuclear energy is incredible.
And the Chinese.
Well, yes, let's not go there. And if you give them control of the nuclear energy, then that's not energy security, is it? That is energy weakness. So we have to redevelop our own nuclear industry, because that is, again, it is going to be cheap and clean fuel that we can use. So yes, I'm very much in favour of that. Yes, and agreed. And we'll go back to that.
We're standing here
yes.
in the biggest rural county, and our farmers are being absolutely abused on a daily basis and being forced to put in wind farms and solar farms. We need to produce for this country, and it's going to go. Our farming industry is going to just be wiped out.
And that's a terrible tragedy.
Absolutely.
And it's bad for food security.
Yes. How are we going to stop that?
Well, the first thing is by stopping this sort of madness about having to put your windmill up and all the rest of it in this way. By the way, the idea of solar panels, I mean, there was this whole sort of argument. I heard on the radio the other day, the number of sunny days in Newcastle, say, compared to Bournemouth, totally different, kind of environment. Why would you try and impose solar in Newcastle? It makes no sense from any kind of perspective apart from some crazed ideology.
It's actually no sense when they're covered in snow. It's no sense at all when they're covered in snow.
Thank you, exactly, all the rest of it. So, you know, come on, we've got to get real about this, which is that the farming industry is key to our food security purpose. Of course it's dying, and we've seen, look at the disasters, you know, thank goodness the government, you know, did their U-turn on inheritance tax, all the rest of it. You know, farmers have been neglected for so long, and they are, you know, the if you like, the basis for everything we do. So we don't have that produce grown here. Importing it would lead to an absolute disaster. Again, from a security perspective, keeping it in the foreign policy, you want to have control of your food supply. You want to have an industry that can supply you in that way. It's good, of course, for areas like this, which it's a main big industry. It's helpful for jobs, of course. It's helpful for prosperity, but it's also helpful for security. And again, we have to see the wins in all these areas. And you know, I think you've seen that obviously the leadership has been very keen to support the farmers in their travails, and will continue to do so. And it's going to require a big heft to get farming back up again and make it an industry that people want to join again rather than leave.
It's not just about the farming though, it's about the rural communities.
Yes, of course it is. It's about a way of life. It's about a way of life, isn't it?
And our history.
Yes, and again, this has been an important part of what made Britain Britain. And we can't lose that way of life. We're not going to all become automatons living in, you know, in metropolitan areas. That's not how this works, and it shouldn't ever work like that either. Of course, America is our indispensable ally. It remains our indispensable ally. The basis of global security since the Second World War has been the UK-US relationship, and more broadly the European-American relationship. And yes, that has undergone some strain over the last few years. But it is strain that has actually occasioned, not simply by President Trump, but by American presidents realising the Europeans have, for a long time, been freeloading and, you know, have not been contributing their share of defence to that alliance, to the thing that we need to be doing in that sort of way. So, could it get back to what it was? No. But the Americans have woken up to the fact that it is not necessarily in their interest to pay for everyone's security. Why should it be? We're a very rich part of the world. We should be doing more in that regard, to spend more money in our own defence. It gives us a voice and a sense of purpose, once again, to do so as well. There are valuable reasons to do it. And I think the thing with the Americans is not that they're not becoming isolationists, they're not becoming inward-looking. What they are looking at is they are assessing the relationships and going, well, what's the point of this relationship? What's the point of a relationship when we are paying for 90% of it and we're getting nothing back from these people in this regard? And they should be doing a lot more. I think there's a rebalancing opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to rebalance that relationship with the Americans, to recognise that they obviously have national interest and we have national interest too, but that ultimately I think we will find that when we do rebalance the relationship, the Americans will be firstly grateful for the idea that we are now playing our part in this, that we will also have rediscovered our own sense, which they want us to do in that respect as well, and we'll be able to do a lot more together because there will be a lesser relative imbalance of power between the parties. Right now, the Americans are the only game in town when it comes to global security. There's no other Europe can't do it. You don't want China doing it, for sure. You don't want Russia doing it, and they lack the capacity anyway, as we've seen. The point is, we've got to deal with the Americans. We've got to show them that we are partners for them, that they want to deal with in that regard. And I think we will find the Americans will inevitably recognise that whatever the short-term gains of doing X, Y, and Z, ultimately their best allies in the world are also the people who think like them in the broadest sense of being democracies, of being, you know, supportive of similar values in that respect. But it does require us to do our part there. And on your point about what is Trump doing with Russia and China, look, Trump and Putin I do think is a weird relationship, there's no doubt about it. Totally very, very unusual. But the thing about Washington and the power structures is that there are multiple ways to get to a certain point. I think Trump sets a certain direction, and then you will zigzag wildly to get there. And I think you've seen that over time in terms of what he's doing in that respect. I think in general, when it comes to Russia, there is a game the Americans are playing, which is, we want to orient Russia against China. Now, I don't personally necessarily agree with this as being a sensible strategy, but there is a view that says we've got to break the Russia-China axis because the Chinese are, you know, the coming power, the coming threat, basically. The Russians are not. Everyone knows the Russians are not the coming power. They are yesterday's power, and they're diminishing even before our eyes. I mean, look at the mess they've gotten into in Ukraine. And look at the mess, by the way, that they got into Ukraine and meant that they couldn't interfere in the Middle East. Syria fell. The Israel war happened, they couldn't do anything. Iran is on the rocks, and Venezuela, they did nothing. Why? They don't have the capacity to do anything. So the question is, can they be dissociated? I don't think they can, but there is a view in Washington that they might be able to do that. They're trying, a lot of policy that way. The aim is, though, to still defend China and look at that. The Venezuela thing, Rubio let the cat out of the bag. He said, we don't need Venezuela's oil. They don't need Venezuela's oil. Yes, it's helpful to American companies, fine, but they don't need it for their own national reserves, but it denies China that oil, basically. And if Iran falls, it denies China that oil. And suddenly China becomes weaker as a result without a shot being fired in that respect. So I think we have to... The Americans think of strategy in a very different way to we do. We used to think like this. When we had a global footprint, we thought of this as well. We thought, what happens if we do this and it could happen that? And we don't think of it that way. We are guilty of playing in 2 dimensions, and the Americans are still playing in 3 dimensions. And I think we have to see how this rolls out. There was a chance you're right, and there are some bad things that will come about it. But I think at the moment, actually, there's a lot of wisdom in what's going on, and it's going to get us to a much better place than before. So I say look at it in 3D rather than 2D.
Is this down to BRICS, though? I mean, the BRICS the countries.
Yes.
Because they're all together in this, like, their own little clique.
Well, they are, but that clique is not a very effective clique today. The BRICS, we're talking about the sort of the Brazil, Russia, India, China, that sort of group. They're trying to create an economic relationship, but it doesn't have any actual firm military basis or anything like that. And actually, again, what we're trying, I think what the Americans are trying to do is to show these countries that actually you want to be associated with the US side of the world rather than the China side of the world. And that's where the battle's coming from. The Americans are under no illusions. They know where the challenge to their power is coming from. It's not coming ultimately from Russia, although Russia's a destabilizing factor, but it's coming from China. And that's why they're focusing on China first, but in my view, they need to do more on Russia as well, because that's part of it. You weaken Russia, you actually weaken China as well, and that will increase the pressure on China. The 50-year plan, this is what the hard left worked out some time ago. It is that if you can infiltrate institutions, you can win even if you lose electorally. Because slowly, you will poison everyone's mindset, and you will be able to get control of their thinking, and then they will start to think about their way. And this morning I was on Times Radio, and what was interesting about it was I was talking about a subject where it turns out that someone did a survey, and 1/3 of university students in this country believe reform should be banned from university campuses. Now this is incredible if you think about it. Reform is a major political party in this country, which, who, if you don't like it, fine, but you should have to engage and debate with the ideas. If you don't like it, tell us why. Tell us what, give us better solutions if you don't like it. Argue, debate, discuss, do those things. Don't ban. That's not a way to do things about ideas like this. But how do we get to that point? Clearly, these students have been inculcated all the way through, as you pointed out. They didn't suddenly turn up in university and go, right, now we must ban reform. Is this something that's come from teaching, and we know this is true now, don't we? Because just this week we learned that a Labour MP was banned from visiting a school in his constituency because the teachers didn't want him there. They disagreed with his views on Israel, or maybe because he was Jewish or whatever in that sort of way. So the mask slipped. We learnt what was going on, and and everyone could see that what's going on is that the teaching unions are riddled with this kind of behaviour, and with this, and a place where they should be absolutely careful about imbuing children with the views that they might have. On the contrary, they're prepared to enforce their worldview now quite openly. They've made a big mistake, I think, by doing this, because they've revealed to everyone what their game is. And what it tells us is as follows. Any new government coming in, and the Tories missed this trick. When they came in 2010, they missed this trick. Any new government coming in must gain control of the institutions. It must have, although Donald Trump has done that, of course. Look what he said, abolishing the Department of Education, gone. Kind of doing shutdowns to get rid of bad civil servants, done, etc., etc. He got it. We need to have, control of the institutions so that people do what they should be doing, which is act in a neutral way. We don't, people necessarily, you don't want to necessarily replace one with the other, but it's about making sure that the institutions do what they're supposed to do, which is either educate or carry out, or whatever it might be, those processes, without fear of political bias countering those views. And we need to get rid of the people who can't do that. All those last week, remember, there were civil servants who said they'd resign. Good, let them go. Those people should not be in the civil service if they can't serve anyone without kind of having a political bias factor in it. So control the institutions is very important. And it's a bit controversial to say this, but there was one man who got this actually. He had other problems, but he got this. Dominic Cummings. Okay, understood the institutional side of it. He understood that you have to come in and do something from an institutional point of view, or else you'll never get a long-term impact. And the left have understood this, and we have failed to understand that for a long, long time.
Just like these questions that you see at reform conferences, I'm going to be like one of the reporters, and I've got two questions.
Oh.
One's history,
okay,
and one is modern. So the historical one, coming back to your relationship with Europe and how we should approach Europe, are you not just talking about almost the EEC before the Maastricht Treaty, where that's what it was, and there was no EU? So that's my first question. And my second one is to do with Iran and Venezuela. So this is like the future question. So Trump has done what he did in Venezuela. Now Rodriguez is there with the rest of the people, and we've heard nothing since then as to how he's controlling it. Mm-hmm. The people of Iran are now going against the regime there, and are they not scared that because this vacuum is being left in Venezuela, that Trump may not do anything to replace that with Pahlavi, for example?
Well, I think you're right on that point, because the fear is that there will not be the action that will come. And so there is a sense that, what does he mean by help is coming? What will the help be? I mean, is it going to be tangible help? Is it going to be moral help? That's not moral views. I mean, there are many things Americans could do. I mean, military strikes are at the end of the line, but they could do other things. For example, if they could, and they've got the capabilities, if they could break through the Iranian internet blockade, that would be big, because firstly, we'd be able to see straight away what the Iranians were doing on the ground to their people, and secondly, the opposition could organise really effectively and could know where to go and do those things. So that would be quite a significant movement. Or if they were attacking regime top-tier people, or stopping the RGC from murdering people, that would be a significant development. Those things would be useful in that regard. But the Venezuelan point is interesting, because, as you pointed out, it looks like Trump has left the old regime in place apart from this top level. Now, I don't think it's going to stay there. And the reason I don't think it's going to stay there is because I know Marco Rubio. And I know Marco Rubio obviously has an interest in Latin America, given his own roots in this sort of area. Mm-hmm. But he also knows that you might need a transition. Let's imagine you've overthrown them, there'd have been chaos, who knows what happened in that regard. You've got to get to a point where there's a transition. And I think what they're going to do, or trying to do, is keep things calm for the moment. So not do what they did in Iraq after the overthrow of Saddam and get rid of everyone and go, right, all of you got to go. Yeah. Because what happened there was it merely meant that you end up with civil war on the ground, because all those people then went, we're out of power, we've got no access to money, we're going to start an insurgency. And that could happen in Venezuela quite easily. So what he's done is leave them in place, and we're going to work a proper plan, as to how we're going to transition into elections and into a proper government. Now, I'm not suggesting that will happen in Iran. It's a very different beast. The regimes are different. Ultimately, if you look at what Venezuela is, it's just a get-rich cartel who profess to be socialist, but they're really enriching themselves. In Iran, it's more complicated, because you've got a whole religious element, but you've also got this whole military side of things as well, and it's a much more complicated relationship. So if you just got rid of the Ayatollah, the regime you would have a dangerous regime still in place, not a defanged one like in Venezuela. So there, I think you have to remove the regime, and I think that could be done by other people. But there's danger of this. If you collapse the regime, there's still a danger that the country will split apart. There might be ethnic fighting, all these things, which is why you're mentioning Pahlavi is really interesting. Because I think, having met him a few times, I think he offers the most realistic transitional possibility for the country, because he is a national figure who can oversee the next phase, that phase that the Americans are doing in Venezuela right now, to get Iran to a place where it could then have a government in place that would be the government of the people finally. So I'm with you on that. How we get there, it's challenging, it's not easy, and it may get rather messy, but a lot of people say, there could be nothing worse than this regime. I'm sorry, this regime is the worst you can have in Iran. It really is. There's nothing worse than this regime based on its history, its ideology, its revolutionary fervour. So I don't buy that. I think we need to get rid of this regime and we can help usher in something better. But ultimately, it's for the Iranians to work that out. We can help them, but it's for them to work it out. And the good news is they are an educated and sensible people. They will work it out if we let them have the chance. And your earlier point about the EEC, yes, but we're not going to be able to recreate that. Europe went down a path. It's not going to go back down that path. It should perhaps never have gone down that path. But and it was a mistake to have done that because again, everyone kind of lost their identity in that. But I think we're going to see more of Europeans rediscovering their identity and working out what they are as French, as Germans, as Italians, as Poles, in that sort of sense. And that will in itself weaken the supranational project and probably turn it into something else down the line. And we can help give that a push. Remember the following. Britain's foreign policy goal for that whole period of 400 years has been to stop one power dominating the continent. And obviously, so whenever there was a power, if it was Napoleon, we'd stop them. The Spanish would try and stop them. If it was the Germans, we'd stop them multiple times, etc., etc. Well, equally, we don't, want a supranational state there because that would be a power that would not be in our interest necessarily. So a looser Europe would be a benefit not simply to the Europeans but also to Britain as well. Okay, yes.
You've answered some of the question because it was about Iran. The first part of it, if we're allowed to, is you're the first person that said that Mr. Trump has decided not to attack Iran last night.
Yeah, that was last night. Yes.
Because he didn't think it was at the right time.
Last night it wasn't the right time. Yeah.
The papers were very much, he's just giving the impression he was frightened off.
No, nonsense. Nonsense. That's absolutely
Trump.
So how do you know that?
Well, look, firstly, it's because I have contacts in Washington, so speaking to people who know people, whatever, I get that kind of perspective that way. So he wasn't frightened. There's nothing to be frightened of from Iran. The Americans will destroy Iran in a straight-out battle. There is a fear, though. You end up in tit-for-tat, sort of strikes, and you want to minimise casualties, don't you? If you're the American president, you want to minimise casualties. And if you think, ultimately, if the balance of probabilities, you take your intelligence estimates, you get your views from from all the people around you, and if at that moment you go, on balance, I can't be certain that I'm going to minimise casualties by doing this, and it's going to achieve what I want to do, you do step back, and that's not a problem stepping back at that point. It doesn't mean you're going to step back forever, because don't forget, the Americans are moving tremendous force into the region. They are moving multiple carrier groups into the region. They are doing other things that are bringing in, and in a week's time, they're going to have way more force than they have today. Okay, in that area, and they'll be able to do a lot more than they have today. So, I've no doubt the regime is reaching out to the Americans as well, trying to cut a deal. That's for sure. Now, I don't know what kind of deal they could possibly present that would be worth Trump accepting, because you can't trust them. But look, who knows? If they say, we're going to give over all our nuclear stuff forever, and we're going to liberalise and do these things, okay, let's see. But in reality, last night was just one night. Tonight's another night. Tomorrow's another night. And the one thing we know about Trump is that he will hit you when you don't expect it. And last night it was very expected he was going to hit them. But if you remember last summer, nobody had a clue when he sent those B-2s in, and it made a big, big difference when he did it.
So it wasn't, as Alex said, about this guy not being hanged.
Not being... they're not stopping the killing. Yeah, they did halt that execution, yes. And maybe that was part of the backstory discussions in that sort of way. But ultimately, it comes down to minimising casualties and working out when do we strike. If the Americans strike, they need to know they're going to win, basically, in that sort of way. When they struck in the summer to destroy that nuclear facility in Fordo, they knew they could collapse it and do it, and they did it because they knew they could do it at that point in time. Now, I'm not sure they think they can collapse the regime right now. Maybe next week it'll be different. So if they do it, they want to do it properly.
And is your friend Palau working with the Trump regime?
We never call it a regime, it's administration. The regimes are the bad guys. So is he working with them? No, he's not working with them per se, because again, that would be a big mistake, I think. If you got seen as a puppet of America, that is not a helpful position for anyone to be in. Again, one of the things that went wrong with Iraq was because the Americans installed a government that was seen to be the puppet of America. What's the point of that? It was not a government that needed legitimacy domestically in that sort of way. So you've got to be careful what you do. And he's not working with Trump, and I know he's not working with Trump. Are they having communication? Yes. There are other Iranian groups that are also having communication in that sort of way. But the key to it is, is he going to be in a position to take over should there be a change? The answer, I hope, is yes, in that way. Someone like Robert Jenrick is only going to be a benefit to this party. He really is. His views are solid and sound. I've known him for 25 years, okay? So I've known him for a long, long time. He's sound on policy, he's right where we want him to be. And I can tell you this, Nigel would not have brought him on board had he not had 100% belief that he had changed his views and that he was going to be a major player going forwards. And, the Tories can say all they like about, we sacked him and all the rest of it. That is simply staunching a wound, because his departure is really significant in the battle on the right of the country to see who will become the next government, because it isn't going to be anyone from the left, is it? It's going to be from the right. And Robert Jenrick represented a solid set of views of people in the Tory party who are now homeless, essentially. And those people know where their home is, they know where Robert Jenrick's found his new home, and I think we're going to see some very big action going forward. So the Conservatives can have their day in terms of getting ahead of the game. Long term, the only winner is Reform UK, and you're going to see how that is going to energise all of us going forwards for those important local elections in May and well beyond. So we can talk a bit more about, things to do with that, but I would pay tribute to our new arrival and also to the wisdom of our leader. I mean, Nigel Farage is the preeminent political strategist of our age. And that's a big statement, I know, but he really is. He has been ahead of the curve on so many issues. He articulates Britain's feelings so well. And he picked this up at very short notice. Yes, there'd been some conversations, but I can tell you this, it wasn't meant for today. And he reacted swiftly because he knew the right thing to do, and he knows what it's going to do to energise the party and take it beyond. That's a leader with vision. That is a leader who we can be proud of, and that is a leader who is going to be the next Prime Minister of this country. Yes. And all of us are going to help him get there, aren't we? But there is a small matter of the world to deal with as well. Yes, we're talking about, politics, but we've had quite a start, have we not, to 2026? I've certainly not enjoyed from a personal perspective having been buffeted every day by news coming from Venezuela or Greenland or Ukraine or now Iran and maybe the Chinese embassy and all these things. What this tells us is that in 2026, geopolitics, foreign policy, whatever you want to call it, is really important for the UK and indeed for every citizen in this country. Because it is certainly the case. So what happens overseas today has a marked influence on life in this country. It has a relevance to what we as a country will be doing and what we will need to be doing when we're in government. And it is a significant player in investment terms, in trading terms, as well as obviously the overarching security and foreign environments. We've called this the West, the world, and challenges ahead. So why have we gone for that? Well, I think the first thing to look at is this idea of the West as a whole. Well, obviously we all know what the West is. But what is the West in today's world? What does it mean in today's world? And I think a lot of what we grew up with, and a lot of people in this room will remember the Cold War, for example, and will know instinctively that the West was the home of the free. It was the home of liberty. It was the home of capitalism. And the Soviets and their acolytes were the bad guys. They were anti-human rights. They locked people up in gulags. They wanted to subsume economic systems, so on and so forth. We knew very clearly what the West was. But I think there's been a moment, hasn't there, for the last 20 or 30 years when, partly because of our own inadequacies in the West and our own sort of reluctance to stand up for those traditional values that were the hallmarks of this country, of the US, and indeed of much of the rest of the West, we've lost a bit of sense and cohesion of who we are in that way. And I think clearly the most significant actor in the West right now, the person who has clearly given us such a sense of leadership again, is Donald Trump. And we can, I'm not going to pass comment on Donald Trump's domestic policies, but I'll say this, look at the transformation he has effected in America in 1 year. It is extraordinary what that country has gone through and changed in just 1 year under Donald Trump. And, in certain ways, I know that we are looking in Reform HQ at how he's done it. Because if you think about what he's done domestically, he's overridden huge opposition. And who here thinks that we wouldn't get huge opposition if we get a government coming in from the civil service, from the unions, from all sorts of people with vested interests trying to stop us? And Trump has shown ways that you can override that and get an agenda going. So he stood up for himself, and he stood up for what he thinks is right. And he's made some very clear and simple distinctions. But internationally, wow, has he made a difference in 1 year. It is extraordinary, contrasting Donald Trump as president this time round, although first time round he was also fairly effective, but with Joe Biden beforehand. Joe Biden, leaderless, rudderless. The West was drifting. We were doing, we were mouthing platitudes the whole time. And nobody knew who we were and what we stood for in any way, shape or form. And as a result, the enemies of the West were able to gain ground in that time and in that period. And they are the same people who have always hated us, the people who support authoritarianism, the people who support dictatorships, the people who still want to lock people up, want to surveil them, want to, all those values that we have felt are axiomatic, they have decided to always fight against. We're talking about Russia, we're talking about China, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about others in that area. They gained under Biden, and Trump has come in and the boot is on the other foot. Because what is quite clear is that once again, the people who were used to being the disruptors, the people who thought, we can control the international narrative, we're the ones who are going to decide what happens in the world, they have now been disrupted by the West again, and by Donald Trump in particular. And if you just look at things that have happened the last few weeks alone, who could believe what happened in Venezuela? Who could believe that Trump, with a flick of his paw, was able to extract the president, the illegitimate president, I should add, of course, of Venezuela, take him away in an extraordinary operation. That operation is worth looking for anyone who likes espionage and anyone who likes intelligence operations. Watch that operation. It was incredible, the level of detail, the planning that went in to that. He went in, took out the head guy of this illegitimate regime and turned the situation round within, a day. An extraordinary outcome which nobody would have thought of beforehand. And the result was that all those people who had been backing Venezuela, Russia, China, Iran, were left flat-footed and disrupted by what he did. Equally, if we look at what's happened in Iran, this is very significant. And look, we're on a knife edge there. Let's firstly, pay tribute to the brave protesters who are out on the streets. Those people on the streets of Iran, of the cities, know full well that they face machine guns, they face rifles, they face extreme violence, but they're still coming out. Why? Because they have the idea of freedom. They want to be free like us. That's what they want to be. And what they are doing while they are out there right now is basically trying to topple one of the most evil regimes in the world. It's a regime that obviously persecutes its own people. It's a regime that also promotes terrorism in the region and globally. It is a regime that destabilizes the whole of the Middle East. The Gulf Arab countries suffer from it. Israel suffers from it. And of course it's also a regime that threatens us in other ways, because it is a regime that's trying to build nuclear weapons. And guess what? The Ayatollahs are not wanting them for any peaceful reasons, are they? They want them for their own power projection purposes. And who the heck knows, in some warped religious doctrine, if they don't think that using a nuclear weapon is a way to bring the end of days, or something like that. That absolutely had to be stopped, and Trump stopped them last summer with the Israelis, with that extraordinary 12-day campaign. And now we have an opportunity here to shape the future of the whole region. Because if the Americans do what they said they will do, they've said they'll send help, and it almost happened last night, by the way, almost. There was a reason why there were no airstrikes last night, and that was because the Americans are not yet sure they can topple the regime with airstrikes. They want to be very careful. We all know that military action is very dangerous if you get it wrong. Number one, you can ending up in a whole tit-for-tat episode. Number two, you could get drawn into a never-ending war, and we've had a few of those, have we not, in our time. But if you get it right, and the military intervention you do has a material effect on changing the course of a country, you can have a dramatic impact, not simply on that country, but beyond. And if that regime were to go, and if the Americans were able to help the people on the ground remove the Ayatollahs, you would have, firstly, an Iran that's friendly to the West, not opposed to it. You'd have an Iran who'd want to trade with us and not the authoritarian bloc. You'd have an end to terrorism in the region. You'd have a normalisation of relations between Israel and Iran. Imagine that. And with the Gulf states, you would have peace and prosperity. So there is a value in the West intervening and doing these things because you'd have peace and prosperity that benefits us with trade, investment, and with alliances. And that is why what Trump is doing and how he's manoeuvring is really of significance, because every time he makes a move like this, and he's able to squeeze China and Russia and countries like that, he's expanding the ability for the West to benefit from the new international constellation. Because be under no illusions here. The world is changing around us. I think we all know that, don't we? We can all see that the world is not the same as it was even 5 years ago. The world is changing, and we have to grab the opportunities that are provided and able to do that in this country and elsewhere in the West to make sure that the reshaping occurs in our way. Because as I said at the start, there are countries out there who have been trying to set that narrative, and they're not friendly to our interests. China is a great example. The Chinese, the Chinese government has for some time, which is, remember, a communist government. It ruthlessly surveils its people. It's crushed freedom in Hong Kong. It is engaging in concentration camps for the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province. This is not a regime that we can have anything to do with on a moral level or even on a strategic level, because it wishes us ill. It wants to steal our intellectual property. It wants our data. It wants to be able to snoop on everything that we do. Not for any good reason. It wants to preempt what we do. It wants to put money into our economy, not because it wants to invest in Britain, because it wants to control Britain. That's the purpose of Chinese investment, to make it impossible to say no to China when China does things, as it will do in the future, like trying to invade Taiwan. And again, we don't want things like that to happen, invasions of other countries, because if you had an invasion of Taiwan, number one, computer chip industry, majorly important. We all got computers, we've got phones, a lot of the chips there come from Taiwan. It's a significant centre. You lose control of that, the Chinese get a huge benefit there. But secondly, trading routes. Okay, just look at the world in your head for a second. Any trade coming from Northeast Asia is going to pass through that area near Taiwan and China. You do not want a war there that's going to block trading lines and supply lines, because again, those are very tight in today's world, and if we don't have those flowing freely, we will suffer as a result of it. So the best result there is to make sure that we are strong and resolute against China. Russia, said at the start, people say reform has a Russia problem. Reform does not have a Russia problem. I can tell you that for nothing. There is nobody I've spoken to in reform who is remotely pro-Vladimir Putin, and for good reason. Vladimir Putin is an aggressive dictator who has launched a war against Ukraine and would happily launch more wars, as he did before Ukraine in places like Georgia and beyond. Crimea, he took those places, and he would do it again and again and again. There's nobody in reform in the High Command who thinks he's a good thing. Does that mean that we're going to go along with any plan at all? No. What Keir Starmer promised last week made no sense. He promised that Britain would send an unknown number of troops for an unknown amount of time onto Ukraine's borders to monitor a peace that isn't even there right now. And Nigel was quite right to say, we back the principle of supporting a peace that's agreed and enforced. We back that principle, but we can't give a blank cheque because we don't have the capability. What was Starmer doing, making that pledge? It was actually, what he's done is giving Ukraine false hope. And if I was a Ukrainian, I said it publicly, if I was a Ukrainian, I would not accept a peace guarantee from Britain of that nature, because I wouldn't believe that we could actually carry it out. What's the point of that? And if he's serious about sending only about 7,500 troops, which is probably, given the current emaciated state of the British Armed Forces, what we could do, what good is 7,500 troops? All that could possibly be is a tripwire, and I don't think anyone wants to be a Russian tripwire here in this way. The better approach is to make sure that Putin cannot do what he's done ever again, basically. And that involves, again, bringing together a coalition of parties and Ukraine and pressuring Putin through economic sanctions and other measures to make it so painful for him to keep on fighting this war or ever fight another war again that you don't need the tripwire, because he knows that what will happen if he does it is economic disaster and the end of his rule. That's the only way you deal with thugs like Putin. They can't deal with anything other than knowing that they will lose from any future encounter. And so, again, what we hope is happening behind the scenes when it comes to peace negotiations and things like that is that the Americans are, and they're starting to do this, really pressuring Putin. Number two, that any deal that emerges is a fair one, and that Ukraine can come out of it, knowing it's got some wins from it, rather than just what Putin wants in this regard. And crucially, that we won't be going to war or seeing another war in that region for a very long time to come. That is the goal of what I think President Trump is trying to do. That is the goal of what the Europeans are trying to do, and even what we are trying to do. And collectively, we have to get to that point, because the challenges ahead are significant. We get it right, we get a world that is going to be a much better place than the one we have today. A world where the West is once again the dominant power, where, for example, America dictates the tone rather than Russia and China having the ability to do so. Where, again, everyone has to listen to what we are saying as opposed to the other way around. You get it wrong, though, and think about the outcomes. If you end up with a world where might is seen as right, where Putin can invade and get away with it, where Xi could invade Taiwan, where Iran can attack Israel, all these things can happen and there are no repercussions. Do you really think that makes Britain safer? Of course not. It means that we are much more likely to face conflict and face danger down the line. So the stakes are high for what is going on internationally, very high. And, there's a lot of criticism of President Trump around things like Greenland, around this idea. And let's be frank, nobody would want to see an invasion of Greenland. That would be madness for many reasons. Not least because it's, a NATO ally, it's part of NATO because of Denmark. And we don't want to see that happening. But is what Trump is saying about security wrong per se? No. We know that in the Arctic, we know that the ice caps are melting. We know that there are now going to be routes across the Arctic where the Russians and the Chinese will be competing for resources and trying to get there. And Russia's right there. If you look at the map, if you look at a map from the Arctic from above, Russia is there. It's there. It exists. The Chinese are trying as well to get ground there. Do we need to beef up security in the Arctic? Yes, absolutely. Just as Trump was right to say that, again, we've not been treating the military as a sensible, looking at it from a funding perspective. We've not been looking at funding and equipping our armed forces in the way we should. He was right about that. He was right that Europe had been freeloading. And everyone's accepted it now. We've all accepted it. We've all recognised that the world is becoming more dangerous again. In order to keep it safe, we have to defend ourselves and tool ourselves up. So again, if we can get in Greenland a solution which brings in a more secure Greenland, which in itself then bolsters the Western space, it's a result. It's a victory. And yes, it's maybe unorthodox as to how you get there, but the end result is what counts. So the stakes are high in this regard. So a final word before we move to questions, I'm sure you've got many of them, about where Britain should sit in all of this. Well, I'm sorry to say that one of the reasons I actually left the Conservative Party was because I felt not only had the party betrayed the principles it claimed to stand for domestically, but also internationally. Who's been responsible for this collapse of British armed forces might? Yes, of course it's this current Labour government which has done nothing to pick it up, but the Tories had 14 years. And in that 14 years, our ability to do things internationally shrank. It shrank because the Tories did not believe that, or did not want to put money and focus onto the armed forces, and that was a mistake because, as we all know, keeping this country safe is the first priority of any government. So I leave you with this thought. A reform government will invigorate the UK domestically. It will bring back first principles of the things that we know have been under threat, whether it is two-tier justice, freedom of speech, border security. But by doing those things, it will also reignite our pride in a nation, as a nation, and explore all the opportunities that we can take in this amazing world of ours. The future is bright, my friends, it is. It's going to be even brighter under reform. The civil service has a problem. And I suspect that we probably will end up having a greater layer of political advisors who will get things done in the civil service, in a similar way to the American system. because you can't necessarily trust the civil service to deliver the results that you would have expected back in the 19th century or whatever, in that sort of sense. So that's a problem, I think, of the civil service, full stop. But where can you find these people? Well, foreign policy is slightly different because you do have to know something about it. And equally, if you're in the health service, you're going to ask, aren't you? You're going to find doctors, you're going to find medical professionals, you're going to find those people who may know procurement, things like that, because you're looking at the NHS, the whole system. And in foreign policy, you'll have to look at people who do understand international affairs and the way of things, but also around the panoply of international affairs. People, for example, who know how to negotiate, who know how to strike good deals, who understand game theory. There's going to be there are going to be people in the realm around that make up the policies that you can attract in that way. But you're going to have that kind of knowledge to come in and be of use and of value. And if you get that there, you're going to have a much broader sense, aren't you? But I think that will end up being, I suspect that we are going to see a much changed civil service model going forwards, because it's quite clear that the current one doesn't necessarily work in the way that governments want it to work. Yes. And then we'll come on to that, yeah.
So, everything you've said so far has been really, sophisticated and understandable. My question really is, why should we believe you? So, I live in Durham, and a lot of people here, they have housing in Durham. This is not home. And I appreciate that you very au fait with the facts, but at the end of the day, you're travelling up from London, you're coming here to talk to us, and you're going to travel back to London at the end of the day, and then 2 weeks' time, you've completely forgotten about it.
I won't forget this. It's been a great evening. I won't forget this. I'm serious.
I hope you won't. But
I won't.
I am worried that
What's he worried about? Not about me forgetting. What are you worried about specifically?
I'll give you some details. I'm worried that there's a collection of you, Robert Jenrick, and just as announced early this week of ex-Tories, that the exact uni party everyone's heard about has been transitioning. Same group of people. We've got a new, now it's Reform. It was Labour, it was Conservatives, now it's Reform. The reason we're here tonight is because we're sick of how things have been going.
Correct.
And we want a different direction. And at the end of the day, if you get the Man United team and put them into Man City, then they're going
to lose. Yeah, they're going to lose. Yes.
And it doesn't matter what badge they're wearing. So why should we believe you? Because I want to believe you, but I've been lied to my whole life. I've been lied to about Jimmy Savile and the BBC and MP's expenses, and Brexit was supposed to be a disaster, and then the Boris wave. I've never had a politician turn to me and tell me the honest truth. So
do you trust Nigel Farage?
I want to. I'm desperate to. I am literally desperate to trust.
To trust someone. You want to trust someone. We all want to trust.
Yes. Yeah.
So I trust Nigel Farage. I mean that in a really serious way. And I trust it. So you're wondering, okay, so all these people who've defected, etc. Look, they've all got a past. Let's realistically think about how we can win this election, right? We have to win this election by assembling a broader coalition of people who are going to be able to firstly win that election and then run the country. But not run the country in the manner it's been run. That's absolutely the case. And I think the key moment for everyone is to look at, are they prepared to go mea culpa, it was wrong, and do that? Because in the past that didn't happen. In the past, all these mea culpas turned into nonsense factors and led into exactly the same sort of policies.
This time it's different.
This time look, I'll say why it's different this time. We've never had a force like Reform that's been out there, that's been created, from nothing essentially 2 years ago, and become this incredible force. So it's made up of people like you, who have come into politics and gone, I want change, I want something different. Reform's vitality doesn't come from people like me defecting into Reform. It comes from people like you who have come out, got on the streets, and gone, I want a difference in this sort of regard. And people like me coming in have come because we've seen people like you and gone, wow, that's something. I knew I was going to defect Reform when I went to Reform Conference, and I saw Reform Conference, and it was so different to everything I'd ever seen in politics beforehand. I've been to many party conferences, not simply the Tory ones. I've been to Labour conferences, Lib Dem conferences, and various others. And they were all corporate-y, and they were all we're going to tell you from the top down how it's happening, it's a business of politics. And this was a conference of ordinary people who had come together, and I spoke to a lot of ordinary people there who would come, ask, why are you here? What's going on? We've never done anything like this before, because it's the first thing we've ever done. We want to make a difference for our country, and we think this is it. And what we've heard here has been amazing, they said. You know, we've seen that we can get involved, we can make that change and do something. And so I'd say the difference is that people like me are coming because of people like you, not the other way around.
So what I would say,
yes.
you're not here to impress the audience, but in your heart...
Yeah, I'm not, because I'm not, yeah.
In your heart, is it, I'm on the side of Dr. Alan, or is it on the side of England and the UK? Like,
I said to you before, this is not the Alan Mendoza show.
I know you can say it, but like, tomorrow, next week, we're going to still be here, and I want you to know that, like, we need you. We need you to be on our side. Like, we don't have the leverage. I'm
on your side because I want this to be a country where my kids can grow up.
Yeah,
okay? I want them to grow up in this country in the way that I grew up in this country and have the opportunity to do what I want to do. Let me tell you something about myself. So I didn't come from a very stable background. Okay, my parents economically were all over the place. We had 2 houses repossessed. Okay, we went from living in very nice conditions to not very nice conditions and yo-yoed back and forth. It was crazy. There were times when I had no money, there were times when I had some money. It was insanity. We had other problems in the family as well. It was not a settled thing. I did have a good education. My parents recognised education, but the only reason I went to a good school was because the state had a system called assisted places back in the day. Some of you remember that, right? Because my parents could not afford for me to go to a private school. They couldn't afford for that. But the state stepped in at the time and realised it was about social mobility. But you know what? There's some clever kids from people who can't afford to go to private schools. We're going to send them to private. It's good for the country. It's good for the country. Labour stopped it in '97. One of the first things they did, and we know what their policies are and all those things. We know that. So I want what I could grow. So I could take a thing, and I've been fairly successful, fine. But the point is, I want my kids not to do worse than me. I want them to do better than me, and that's the key thing. And we only do that if we're working together with this country. And I want this country to recover its swagger. This country is an amazing country. It's been, you know, the wonder of the world. It's done things that other countries only dream of. We've lost that pride. I want it back. I want all of us to be, you know, rowing in that same direction, building a Britain we're all proud of. So that's what I'm in this for. Yes, sir. Thank you for coming.
Given that you are a gentleman who has run politics, who's been around Westminster, Nigel himself says he thinks there's an election in 27. How probable do you think that is?
Well, he's saying it because of the reasons I gave you. He thinks there's going to be a financial, kind of, and he should know. Look, he was a city trader. He knows the city very well. He thinks that fundamentally the government is going to implode economically because it cannot deliver. And we're seeing it, aren't we? You know, we were told, they turned the corner on growth, they changed their policies. Minus 0.1%. Come on, this is not going anywhere. So at what point do the wheels fall off? At what point do we have yet another black hole appearing next year and the Chancellor coming again for another tax raid because she can't afford to fill the coffers? At what point do the financial institutions go, this isn't going to work, you're taxing people so heavily that you've now reached the point where you cannot generate the money to run the country? So at that point, I think there's a realistic chance we could have an early election. And then again, we're getting ready for that. It may not happen, okay? It may not happen. But he's right to be ready. He's right to say that he thinks it's going to happen then, because it easily could happen then. And I think we've all got to be ready for that moment to seize the chance, because, damn it, we'd much rather have that than wait till 29, wouldn't we? Yeah. Exactly. Let's go down that road.
Everybody else, but I'm championing at the bit to get that campaign going.
We all are. We all are. But we've got to win the local elections first. That's really important. With them all, but I think actually on a serious note, because you don't have elections here, do you, this year, right? So we need we need mutual aid, people to go and help in those areas, because that's going to be the single biggest determinant. If we can get mutual aid from areas that don't have elections into areas that do, and get the doors knocking and get the people out on election day, we will have stunning success. If we don't do it, we run the risk we won't win as many seats as we thought we would, and that would not be a good thing. So we really are all going to have to be out there doing it and getting out there, getting the vote out in other places, because it all means a combination to getting us towards that target you wanted us to get to. Yes, that's the last question. I didn't know. Yes.
Who in Reform is actually looking at what worked in the past? It's like Back to the Future. We don't want to go backwards. I'm talking about examining what really worked and picking it up and potentially running with it again, because it connects with so many things. It connects with the traditional, you know, matrons on the ward in the NHS rather than fabulously gifted nurses behind a computer filling in notes when they couldn't tend to a patient. It applies to the gentleman when he's talking the truth about schools, because from my own experience, my sister, you know, I was born in Berkeley, she went to Chesley Street Grammar. The Labour Party in '70 closed off the entry to the grammar school. I didn't go to the grammar school. I went to a comprehensive school which wasn't funded, which had a flat roof, it was leaking. I got a report card when I left. So I was a guinea pig, and it wasn't a good lesson really. I did quite well, but I actually even had to pay for some of my exams because they said, you know, it was madness. It was absolute madness. And my eldest sister, my late brother, they had the secondary model system, they had a grammar school system, it was fabulous. Why change it? Everybody, they actually all went to an apprenticeship or a job as themselves. And then in relation to building, my brother-in-law's a millionaire. When he retired, he wanted to work still, so he went into building social housing.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yes. Well, he's down in Bournemouth now, but we're building social housing in Wales. And then, of course, you get the project practically finished, and then somebody decides to change a specification, and it costs them an absolute fortune to upgrade it and to do it again. It's all crazy.
Yes, it's sickness. Yes.
That's why I'm a massive believer in looking back to see what worked, to pick it up, and if it was sound, to run with it, because most of it's been dropped. You know, my daughter's in her 40s now, but when she was a child and I phoned for a doctor, I was put on a blacklist, actually, for asking for a doctor to come out to my sick child. And I said, you can put me on any list you like, because I grew up in a system where we had the GPs, they came out.
And they knew your name, didn't they? You knew your doctor and they knew you, yes.
Every one of them.
Yes.
So if there was nothing wrong with you, probably they'd say, oh, I'll give you a tonic. It could have been orange juice for all we cared, but it's community care. And it's all awry. And we had the system, we had everything. We had our local police officer, Rob Soppert, all the police houses at the top of the street. And if my dad said to us, you can do what you like, but don't bring trouble to my door. And he meant don't bring police. Don't bring trouble. And we wouldn't, because we were a community where everybody was anti-somebody.
Exactly, yes.
Rob Soppert, the sergeant, would say, what, you don't stand on that wall. Can you believe it? Standing on a wall. The audacity of us at the time. How times have changed.
Yes.
You better move because I know where you live. And if he'd gone to our door, they wouldn't have complained about the police officer. It would have been us. It's all crazy. So I just really believe we need to go back in lots of ways to what was sound, what worked, to run to the future.
No, look,
it's madness.
Exactly, and in many ways we're now living in the ruins of a superior civilization.
Absolutely.
It once worked and now it doesn't. I mean, and we changed it from a system that worked into not.
All the time.
Over a long period of time, either as ideology or a desire to tinker in that sort of way. But I can assure you that Zia Youssef is running some of the policy direction, of course, and Danny Kruger is helping him on that process, and you are getting people who are looking at the whole swathe of things across the policy areas. And your plea, I'm sure, is being listened to, right, not in real time, but they are listening to it spiritually, and we're going to get there. So have hope and faith. Good.
Alan, it's been a fantastic evening, but all good things must come to an end. And I'm going to ask Richard.
It's true. As a famous actor always said, always leave them more, wanting more, not less.
Totally
That's the thing. It's right there. Right.
Alan, you've been wonderful.
Follow that, as they say. On behalf of the City of Durham branch and all our guests, I'd like to thank Alan for coming to talk to us this evening. We've had a lot of extremely good guests come to to talk to us, but I think you'll agree with me and Reese, because he said it earlier, that Alan has been by far the very best guest speaker we've ever had. Also very proud that this is the first gig he's had since he joined the party, and that he chose to come to the City of Durham. We need to give a vote of thanks to our chairman Reese, who it was through his endeavours that Alan's here today. So thank you, Reese.
Took some reeling in.
As Alan said, the world is changing, and I can't imagine, or couldn't imagine really until this evening, how much international politics plays such an important part in our daily lives. And I think Alan has shown that very, very well. It's been incredibly informative and very entertaining. I can't imagine anyone better to be the Foreign Secretary for the first Reform government, which we hope is in the very near future. I mean, he knocked spots off the current incumbent a bit, and her predecessor, David Dunn-Lammy. So we wish Alan all the success, and once again, if you can demonstrate your appreciation by giving him the final round of applause. Thank you.